finish out looking at Luke today by highlighting a couple passages on one of the big themes of Luke, and that's prayer. Why don't you go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 11, 1 through 13, and keep your finger there, and also find your way to chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Could I have someone who hasn't read yet stand and read Luke 11, 1 through 13? Thank you. And then would someone else be ready that has not yet read in class for chapter 18, verses 1 through 8? Who can do that? Okay. I'll say thank you. Whenever you're ready, Ethan. Oh, and I'm sorry. Let me hold you just for a moment. While he's reading, I want you to listen through Jesus' teaching and his story. I want you to pay attention to the characters, the kinds of mood and actions in this story, and think about that in relation to prayer. This is what Jesus is teaching us on and telling this story. So I want you to really pay attention to the characters and think about what that means and the implications for prayer. We're going to talk about that for a little while. Go ahead.
One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples." He said to them, "When you pray, say, 'Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day your daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us. And lead us not into temptation.' Then he said to them, 'Suppose one of you has a friend, and he goes to him at midnight and says, "Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, because a friend of mine on a journey has come to me, and I have nothing set before him." Then the one inside answers, "Don't bother me, the door is already locked, and my children are with me in bed. I can't get up and give you anything, I tell you." Though he will not get up and give him the bread, because he is his friend, yet because of the man's boldness, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. So I say to you, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find it, knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him?
Thank you. I love this story and this teaching. And the next one is like it. What do you find here in this story? What's going on? Who do we have? Who is in bed in this story? Children and who else? What's that?
Him, the guy.
The guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the problem? He doesn't want to get up. What's the situation? This is very common. This is very common in their culture, this kind of setup with parents sharing space, small spaces, living together in single room spaces and things, and sharing beds. Your hard-working lives, tired. If he gets up, he's tired. If he gets up to wake up his children, they'll be cranky and they'll be crying all day the next day. You know, the things that happen with a normal family. And he doesn't want to listen to his friend. And here's what's so interesting about this story. Who is in mind with the man in bed? What was that? God. Yes, God. Does anybody else find this humorous or peculiar? Yeah. So, Jesus, you could say, is risking, in one sense, by telling a story and making God out to be an uncaring, tired man in bed that doesn't want to listen to his friend. Jesus is telling a story that really gets people's attention. And even when I think about how careful I am usually when I'm thinking up illustrations to try to, the message or something, you don't normally want to paint God in a put him in a bad light. So this is very interesting. He's not really wanting to listen to his friend in this story. We have a few things here we want to look at in this first story. Story number one. We have coaxing of a friend who is otherwise not inclined to help, even though they share a meaningful relationship. Relationship is very important in these two stories, especially this one, relationship. So we have one person that has a legitimate need, which is provisions for hospitality. Hospitality is very important for community relationships and treating one another with kindness. Should be more important in our society and local church culture, I'd say, than it is today. Very important, and it's a need for food in a legitimate way, but the man that has the means doesn't want to listen, he's tired, doesn't want to wake up his kids, doesn't want to get out of bed and have to go through all that again. And the story happens that because of his bold persistence, the man in bed is finally convinced. And Jesus makes the relation to this, says because of the man's boldness in verse 8, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. Okay, he'll get up and give him what he wants. And then he makes the direct connection to prayer. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock in the door. All those things that just happened in that story. On the door. Waking up his friend. We're sleeping. It would be great to put that to a dramatization. Have like some of you act that out. And like the guy in bed, what do you want? Is sleeping in bed. And just really bring it to life. How it would have been in their minds. And would really do it justice, and I think it would be hilarious. I find tons of humor in this. And then he makes an important qualification. He compares this unwilling person in bed who finally gives in to God, to fathers who care for their children, and then in verse 13, to our Father who cares about us more, he says, and is willing to give us the Holy Spirit when we ask him. The good things of God and the Spirit of God in our lives and his work and his gifts. And so these are important things to pay attention to here, with the emphasis on the answer coming through bold persistence. Hold that thought. And let's hear now Luke chapter 18, 1 through 8. Maria, Jose, thank you.
Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?
Thank you. Let's talk about the characters in this one. What do we have? What's the mood here? What do you think of this judge? What do you think? I mean, you be honest.
Dude's a jerk.
He's a jerk. That's right.
Putting it lightly.
And that's exactly the word I used in the first session. And he's worse than a jerk because he has power. And in that society, when you have widows and people who were very vulnerable, they relied upon things like just judges because of people around them looking to take advantage of them, and people taking advantage of vulnerable ones. And they relied upon, we rely upon those things in that day, but not as much with the kind of corruption that could so easily happen in this time. They relied upon it. And here we have a judge. Not only does he not care about people, he doesn't care about God. It's a very interesting story.
He's a postmodern guy.
And he even proudly, you've got to hear the sarcasm almost in Jesus' story. He even declares it. Though I don't care about people or about God, if this lady doesn't leave me alone, and the language, the word picture that is there that's translated in different ways, but it catches the meaning, the way it's translated. If I don't do what she says, she's going to give me a black eye. And it was a saying in that time, meaning she is going to aggravate me to my core, and I don't like people anyway. I can't stand this lady. Wish she would just shut up and go away. That's exactly the kind of feeling that is in this passage. Could Jesus be risking anything by telling this story? Who is the judge? Who's in mind with the judge? I heard it again. Yes. Somebody said God. But he makes an important qualification that we need to capture because it's connected to the story. He is careful to qualify it by saying, verse 7, and will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? So he makes an important comparison here between the unjust judge and God who is judge by bringing up the issue of justice and saying, though in this story we have someone who's a complete jerk, and this is our terms, God is your father and he is just, but, the story teaches, the lack of answers to prayer sometimes makes him seem like this judge or the tired, unwilling man in bed. And what is the answer to that? Chauncey, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I don't think necessarily that Jesus is aiming God the Father out to be like this because we know that God the Father cares for his children.
Right.
I think what he's saying is to pray to God as if you were going to this judge in whom he describes here that couldn't care less about you. Like you said, persistence. And even the thought hit me this morning in prayer that so oftentimes we look at prayer as what we would like to see have happen, but yet God works in mysterious ways, and people get angered by the results of prayer because it isn't what they expected.
Yes, and that's important to keep in mind here. Let's look at the details here, and let's keep thinking about this. Yes, Maria.
Is it like the verse where it says, where he replies to the Canaanite woman, he says, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. It's like God saying this hard stuff, but he's really just saying to have like faith and keep just knocking. Like he's not literally saying that he's a bad judge. He's like trying to make us understand that we have to be persistent.
Yes, and in the story with the lady who came back at Jesus in a very, intelligent and pointed way, well, even the dogs get the crumbs. That, I would say, Jesus was more clearly speaking to reality that he came for the Jews. But through her persistence and her faith, he opened up to her. But in this story, that's very important. Jesus is making it clear with his teaching here and his qualifications that God is not the unjust judge. What a story like this would do, these two stories. See, this is, remember, they didn't have no movies, no TV, no YouTube, no videos, none of that. So when there was a public storytelling, when someone would say, we're going to tell a story, that was like, wow. When you could go with a group of people and hear story time or hear someone, and then in the Greek culture, you had the speakers and everything. And you had to hear this, it was like story time. And it was very entertaining for people, very engaging. Still in cultures where everybody doesn't have access to movies and televisions and things and media, still stories are so captivating for people. When there's a turn in the story, it would not be unusual with a crowd like this, hearing a story like this, when Jesus said, and then the judge says, though I don't care about God or people, for people to go, to react out loud and just have a very emotional response. Oh my, how horrible. It just would be so moving for people. And so he really grabbed them with this story of this awful person and this powerful, bold lady. And let's think about the lady and her persistence. When she found out that this judge was unjust, what position did she put herself in? I won't have it. And she appeared in this story, day after day, she came before him with the same request. And the issue of persistence is so important with this. When we keep in mind the comparison that is made, that God, if you can get your way with total jerk, power, hungry people like this, how much more with your Father who has more power than these kinds of people? And really, he's scarier because of who he is, but he is your Father and he loves you. How much more when you are bold and persistent in coming before him and praying? And so over and over she's refused until she annoys him down to his pinky toe. It's the way I put it with my kids. Not sure if that made a lot of sense. But down to his very last cell in his body, he was annoyed and he gave in. Jesus qualifies it and makes the comparison between a loving Father who is God and judge and this unjust judge who's different. And then he explicitly applies this to God's people crying out day and night for his help and deliverance. Let's think about the needs that are here. One is for hospitality, daily food and provisions. It's very legitimate. It's not like, I really want that new car that just rolled out on the assembly line. Mine is 3 years old already, and I just want a new one. Okay, it's not anything in that realm of materialism. This is very legitimate. Story number 2, all the more so, a vulnerable person who is being treated unjustly. What does the Old Testament tell us about issues of justice? God judged his own people at times because they were not treating people justly. Sometimes even aliens and foreigners. They were not treating them justly, and God brought judgment on his people for those things. And he wants justice. So it's very close to their hearts, the story that Jesus is saying. And we have this issue of boldness and persistence. And I want to read a thought to you first. When we think about prayer as relationship with God, and this, we get this from Luke, from these stories. And when we think about conventional teaching about God's activity in the world and his sovereignty, what is conventionally taught, or you could say classical Christianity, is often like this. The study of the nature of God has traditionally emphasized strongly God's sovereignty. What does that mean? Anybody? His sovereignty. He's in control. That he controls everything and has planned everything out completely ahead of time and will in no way ever change anything. That's pretty true to conventional classical Christianity handed down to us from Augustine and the classical period there. Has he really planned out everything ahead of time? And the implications of classical, conventional teaching is, without us will, because he will not change his will based upon what we do or ask. That is normally the implication whether or not we realize that. Matthew.
I would put it to actually something discussion I had last night with the ministry team and stuff, that it's while God does have the power and ability to control him in that way if he wanted to, he doesn't. I don't know, I was looking forward a bit in the notes, and he doesn't really heavy-handedly enforce himself on us, but I would say that he does have a grand scheme of things, he does have a grand plan, but it's up to us whether we want to follow it.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't force us to follow what he's got going on. He says,
Mm-hmm.
kind of says, here's what I want to do, and you guys can either jump on board or do your own thing. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With his will for our lives, yeah, and the way of following him in holiness and righteousness, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it starts bringing up these questions. Well, what is planned? And is there something that's not planned? And the first two questions are, does God have the power to control all things?
Yeah, he can do whatever he wants.
Absolutely. I believe that with all my heart. The other question is, does he use that power to control all things? Some people would, there's differences on that. But what do we get from these passages? These passages stand in sharp contrast to a view of God heavy-handedly controlling all things. And I want you to notice here that I am asking a question. I am not making a pronouncement of doctrine on this. I'm asking a question. There's a big difference between those two. What if answers to prayer are not always so much a matter of God's will, but of our persistence?
That's good.
And it's a question about the relationship between God's foreordained will and his desires and our persistence, and what is the measure of give and take that's there. It's a question. And I'm not wanting to make statements about this. I'm just wanting to look at what happens when we... Now, I don't think that these kinds of questions would have been asked. This question right here wouldn't be that big of a deal to the people at this time. Especially the Jewish people who have been raised on the psalms of lament, crying out and complaining to God about injustice and hardship in life. Not about the faucet broke and I'm stressed out today and, I have to go to the store again. I'd really just like to sit around, not petty complaints, but complaints about grievous situations in life and heartache and loss and injustice and the seeming unwillingness of God sometimes to do anything about it. That's a part of lament. Seems like, God, what are you doing? So this wouldn't be so non-conventional to them in this time, but for us it is, with some of the streams of our heritage in the faith. So I ask the question, just to get us to think about it. Here's an important word, a concept, and that comes up in here, this Greek word. It's in verse 8, chapter 11. Anaidia. And the idea is persistence, boldness, and I like this last definition here of the ones, there are others, there are many actually. If you go to biblos.com or some of your Greek study tools, there are a whole bunch of descriptions of the word. Shameless audacity is the idea that Jesus gives in prayer. Someone put shameless audacity in your own words. What does that mean to you? Shameless audacity. You think of being shameless and audacious. Is that something that you can do before God?
Yeah.
Shameless and audacious? What? Somebody put it well when they said it would be like today. You have a desire to, you know that the only person that can fix your situation. It is so internationally interconnected, the complicated situation you've got yourself in, and we're speaking theoretically, hopefully, is so internationally bound, the only person is the President of the United States. And you walk up to the first Secret Service officer in the line of officers and vehicles and black Cadillacs and all of those things. And you say to him, I need to speak to the President of the United States. What's going to happen?
No.
Thank you. There won't be a lot of thought or pause. There won't be a long, dramatic pause. There will be a not today or no. And if you ask again, what will happen? You may get physically pushed. And if you ask a third time, you may be brought down to the ground if you come up a third time. Right? But the position of that person is, they believe if they persist properly, notice in Jesus' story, the lady didn't attack the judge. She didn't charge the judge. She was going through the proper lines. Going through the proper lines day after day, maybe when the president is out of office and it becomes a little bit more of a legitimate conversation, he could set up a meeting with you 6 months in advance in a highly secure location, right? So I think that's a good comparison. I loved it that someone else shared it in the other class. This is the kind of feeling that you get with this unjust judge, but she puts herself in a position believing that if she is persistent enough, her need will be met. So I want to ask you, with the situations in your life and needs, how you view them when you bring them before God. Legitimate needs, broken relationships, issues of provision in your life, or wrongs, injustice. Maybe you don't have a big situation of an injustice going on right now. There are things that God has put in your heart that you take to Him in prayer. How quickly do you resign yourself when it seems that there's a no because nothing happens? How quickly you just say, well, not God's will, and you drop it? What do these passages say to us?
Keep at it.
Keep at it, that's right.
You've got nothing to lose.
And never
Right.
forget.
There's a problem when we start making rules about things that, well, we just can always steer God's will, and He will change everything because He loves us so much. When we start down that road, we're going to get into trouble pretty fast. But what about the other direction that says God never changes His mind? He has determined everything in advance, and we just need to surrender to His will. You know what that is? That's faith. That's treating God and our lives as if there is this fate for us that we just have to always resign ourselves to.
Tension of the law.
There's tension, yeah. But there is a time and a place to be audacious and shameless before God. And when you know who He is, you're also going to be reverent before Him and worship Him. Yeah. Audacious and shameless. Here's the International Varsity Press New Testament commentary on these passages, on one of these passages. It talks about this key term that in the NIV says boldness. And it's a key term in this passage and in this story that Jesus is telling because it contains two ideas at once, both boldness and shamelessness. This kind of prayer has gall. Nothing will stop such a request from being set before God. The response is still God's choice. That we don't ever forget. The response is God's choice. Who's ultimately in charge?
God.
But the door is open for the request. It's a relationship. Did you ever ask your parents for something that you desperately wanted, and they said no, and they never changed their mind, but you knew they still loved you? Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did you ever pour out your heart, and they had said no, and then they said yes to something legitimate? That never happened to you, hopefully. So we get this idea here. The door is open with God.
I was trying to think about it. I was thinking about the idea of shameless audacity, how to kind of rephrase it. It's the idea of, I don't care how crazy my request is going to sound, I'm going to bring it to God and just give it to Him. People may think it's stupid, people may think I'm nuts, people may just,
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yep.
care what people think, I don't care what anyone thinks about God, and I'm just going to bring it to Him and
Yep.
leave it to Him.
Yep. That's right. Doesn't matter what people think about it. People will think things. When you're shameless and audacious with God, People are going to think things, but we just have to be like, you know what? They're always going to think things. And there will always be people that think things, thoughts that we don't like. And there are going to be things and situations where it's very emotive and there's deep within us cries and it comes out loudly or painfully or with great tears. Those are not things that we have to keep away from God. He is not scared by our inability to maintain a stoic position on all situations. That's not his intention for our lives, is it? But we also don't have to work up something. There are some things we just need to continually bring before the Lord, whatever we're feeling about it. And we just bring before God, and we bring it before God, and we bring it before God. All right. Anybody have any thoughts or questions before we move on? Yes?
Do you think that has to be like a God-given, like, I don't know, like English or like desires out of us, or do you think that doesn't just be like our own personal, like, tenacious?
That's a great question. I think one thing to think about is what the legitimacy of the need. If it's something having to do with justice or provisions, we get those directly from the passage. If it has to do with things that are close to God's heart, scripturally, broken relationships, legal things, morality in society or in a situation, or legally or governmentally, morality and things like that, I think we can know that those are close to God's heart. And I would say that there are some things he puts in us. And we have then an intercessory call to cry out to him for certain things. That may not have otherwise been something that we would have gone towards. But I want to say, because of how over the years I've come to view what it is to have a relationship with God, that the door is open for us. Even when we're not, is this something that God put in me prophetically? Or did he drop this in here? Or is this just my human condition and wanting to cry out to God for change in the situation? I think that it's fair to say the door is open. Absolutely open for that. And the choice, when we stay in the position that God is God and we're not, and we are willing to always have in view that the choice is his and that he's loving no matter what, then I say we're in a good position. And I don't know how often we're ever able to perceive clearly where it came from or what he thinks about it. And I say what we get from the passage, Caitlin. So whatever the situation is, when it's fair to say it's a real legitimate concern to take to God, we should ask and believe until there's closure to the situation, whether a yes or a no, until it's closed. We're praying for someone who's sick, who's deathly ill. Pray until they're healed or dead and believe. Because we get the sense that there are some things that we are not going to receive unless we ask. There's some things waiting for us to be handed to God's church and his people, but only if we ask for it. Chauncey.
My dad, before he passed away, taught me the acronym in prayer, PUSH. Pray until something happens.
Pray until something happens. Push. Very good. Thank you, Chauncey. That's great. That's
I
great.
feel that, like you were saying,
Awesome.
In the situation of an illness, deathly illness, pray until either they're healed or until God decides that he's going to take them home to be with him. And even then, continue to pray. Pray for the family. Pray for those who were involved in the care process. Prayer should be an everyday aspect of our life because it's our communication with God. People want to know what God's will is for their life, but they're not willing to take it up with the Father, the only one who knows that will. And how are you going to find out what that will is without talking to him?
When my dad finally told my family that he had melanoma, by that time he was already at most usually terminal stage for people, like skin cancer. and because it moved way beyond his skin, it was in the system and things. And so I didn't really know a lot about it. I didn't know that it was almost terminal at that point. I didn't understand. And I just thought it could be fixed with surgery and things. And I started praying, and I was praying I was having dreams, I think just from the upsets and the grief, but I really hoped it was the Lord. And I had this dream of my dad as an 85-year-old man, and I was like, oh God, I want him to live to be an old man. Which he didn't. And one night I was sitting on our living room floor, and I was praying for my dad. I was crying out to God, interceding for his healing. And I felt like the Lord said, stop praying for your dad. Not that but that more of the sense, you have prayed enough. You have prayed enough for your dad. Let me handle it. And I haven't ever had that happen before or since. And I'm still not sure how clear that, but I just suddenly was like, there was like this, it was almost like a pop. The bubble burst and the air was out. And I felt like the Lord said, you have prayed enough for your dad. And then a few months later, he was dead. Yes?
Someone that I knew, like, they got in a really bad car accident, and they were in a coma for, like, a month, like, almost dead, like, almost dying, like, every day. And, like, everyone was praying for him, and, like, she recovered and was so well, but then after that, like, she still had, like, all these health problems. I remember my old friend was like, because everyone stopped kind of praying, like, when she, like, had recovery, you know? And he was like, he really did believe, he's like, I feel like she didn't get 110% recovery because people stopped praying. Like, what do you think about that?
That's, to make that a very certain statement is dangerous. To be very certain about that is dangerous. Because of this tension, where ultimately God's in charge. There is a relationship. I think clearly Scripture paints the picture that our relationship involves God doing things because of what we ask and say, and how we respond to Him. That there are things He does differently because of our involvement in His life as God. But to make something certain, I think, is a problem.
Right.
And so, because that very quickly comes across as judgmental, and it's not that there aren't certain things we can make good judgments and sound judgment about, but that's not clear.
Right.
That's not clear. So I've said things like that over the years, different times, look back and think, oh. Then there were other times where God protected me from saying things like that with grieving people, like when I was a new pastor and had this traumatized person coming into my office for counsel, and I just look back and say, God, thank you that I didn't make any big, heavy theological pronouncements over this person's life. And He really protected me. I hope I'm learning more and more that with situations like that, rather than saying something like that, we just keep loving on people and praying, and I just don't know if that's helpful, that kind of a statement. I don't think that that person has disqualified themselves from pastoral care ministry or something, saying something like that. But, and it might be true. See, that's the thing, he might be totally right in the situation. I don't know if we can know it. I don't think we can. But I still think we should pray until the situation comes to an end. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you for your input, everybody. Good. Let's see if we can get an introduction here to the Gospel of John. What's that?
I love the book of John.
Yeah. Yep. Many people, when they come to Christ, are told to begin by reading the Gospel of John. And there are some reasons for that.
Beautiful book.
It is. I still find that my heart is warmed more so in reading about Jesus in John than in the other Gospels. It's not that God hasn't ever spoken to me powerfully, or that I view the others as less important, but for me personally, it's been more meaningful. And I can say that I've had the experience that others have had, that when you read Jesus, that this is really someone I want to know. if he's like this, and this is, for new believers, he's really alive. I really want to know this person. If he talks like this and treats people this way, I want to know this person. And so, there's some good reasons for that. When we find out about John, his situation and who he was and how he related to Jesus, it gives us even more insight to why maybe John, his gospel is this way. Let's talk about some of the things we know about John. Possibly was a cousin of Jesus. He was one of the 12. He was a follower of John the Baptist and one of the first to follow Jesus. When Jesus came along to the river, down to the Jordan, John was there with John the Baptist, and he was already giving his life to a radical faith, following John the Baptist, and was turned to the new thing that God was doing, and he was living out his faith in a radical way, and he became a follower of Jesus after John the Baptist. He was probably the youngest disciple. The term beloved, the way that it is used there in that time, was used to refer to a young person. This will be a surprise to some of you. And even later on, you remember when at the tomb, when Peter and John ran to the tomb, who got there first?
John.
And Peter was almost for sure the oldest disciple, much older than the others. And it's very possible that because of his youth, John was able to whoop him on the way to the shore, to the tomb. And when you look at all of this, what I read from scholars is that John, when he became a follower of Jesus, was likely in his mid to late teens. And I want to say mid-teens. And I'm saying late. I'm giving that in there for some of the voices that say maybe later teens. Change your view at all? The rest of the disciples, late teens, 20, maybe early 20s, is what scholars say. When you take what's here, and when you take in the Jewish community, when you had teachers and their disciples, how things normally were. What do you normally see disciples portrayed as in movies? 42, right?
30-year-old dudes.
Older than Jesus many times. They've got like gray beards. And Jesus is the young teacher teaching them. Jesus was young. In his early 30s, 30 and early 30s. These guys were younger. John was likely a young teen here, following Jesus, the beloved.
It shows that you're never too young for God to use you.
Oh yeah. Now there's something to think about that's worth thinking about, and that's the comparison of when people matured culturally then and now.
Right.
There's a reason people could marry when they were 14 and 15 in this day.
In Jewish culture, when you turn it's around 12 or 13, you're considered a man.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep, you got your bar mitzvah, and bas mitzvah. Yep.
But isn't there an age of accountability? Like, isn't 21 the age of accountability?
In our culture.
In Jewish culture, the age of accountability, I don't know, Hannah. In that culture. Back then, yeah, I don't know. That would be a very interesting point to find out.
21 is for our culture today.
Well, it was, yeah, definitely for our culture, but she was saying back then, so,
You're an adult when you're
Depends on-
18.
yeah.
You can be tried or something.
Yes,
I don't remember where I saw this or read whatever,
What
but
does
I read
it
somewhere that in ancient like Rome, during the Roman Empire, the age that you could inherit your father's or mother's property was 21 or something.
at 21,
Yeah.
okay.
So I'm wondering if that 21 significance started way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not necessarily adulthood, but I guess to a certain extent adulthood.
There's some legal things with that and where the standing in society and things. Yeah. Yeah. So it does cause us to think about how, God views generations and the way we view generations. Your own generation. I think about this. Very quickly, John was in the inner circle along with James and Peter. You will see in the Gospels often a special mention of Peter, James, and John.
Yep.
Is that because Jesus loved those three more than the rest of the disciples? That he would want them with him more often and not the others? Why was that? It was because of he had a special intimacy with those three. That helps us with the voice of John in Scripture, his authority on so many details about Jesus that we don't get from other writers. He was in the inner circle. He has reason to have information that the other writers didn't. John escaped the outbreak of persecution under Nero. Some of the other disciples were executed. John was not. He was later banished to Patmos by Emperor Domitian, which is where he wrote Revelation. He also authored 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And the Gospel of John was written to Christians in Asia Minor. We'll just do the last slide.